The voice that crackled through NORAD's secure communications channel at 3:47 hours was tired, hoarse, and completely unauthorized. Staff Sergeant Martinez nearly dropped his coffee when the unidentified transmission cut through the static of routine morning chatter. The voice belonged to someone who shouldn't exist in their system, a civilian, by all accounts, requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing at Cheyenne Mountain's restricted airspace. Control, this is. This is Phantom requesting immediate emergency landing authorization. I have a situation here. The voice wavered slightly, betraying exhaustion and something deeper, fear, perhaps, or resignation. Martinez's fingers flew across his console, running voice recognition protocols while simultaneously alerting security. Every protocol screamed violation. Unknown aircraft, unauthorized frequency, no flight plan, no identification beacon. But something about that voice made Martinez pause before hitting the scramble alert. There was a quality to it, not just the weariness, but an underlying precision in the radio procedure that spoke of extensive military training. The caller knew exactly which frequency to use, exactly how to phrase the request, and exactly what information to provide without being asked. Phantom, this is Cheyenne Control. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and state your aircraft type. Martinez kept his voice steady, professional, even as his hand hovered over the emergency response button that would launch interceptor jets within minutes. The response came after a long pause, heavy with static, and what sounded like wind rushing through an open cockpit. Control, I'm flying a modified P-51 Mustang, tail number November 77 Charlie Whiskey. I've got a 7-year-old passenger who needs immediate medical attention. I repeat, child medical emergency. Martinez felt his blood chill. A P-51 Mustang, a World War II fighter plane, in 2025. The voice recognition software was still running, cross-referencing the vocal patterns against military databases spanning decades. Security alerts were cascading across every screen in the control room, but that mention of a child changed everything. Phantom, maintain current heading and altitude. Do not deviate. We're running your identification now. Martinez's supervisor, Captain Torres, had materialized beside him, her face grim as she watched the cascade of security violations pile up on the monitors. The voice came back, softer now, almost broken. Control, I know this looks bad. I know you're probably scrambling birds right now, but I need you to run my Voiceprint through the legacy systems. Tell the General that Echo 77 needs to come home. Echo 77. Martinez's breath caught. That wasn't just a call sign. That was a designation from the classified files, from operations that officially never happened. His hands trembled slightly as he initiated the deep archive search, knowing that whatever came back would change everything. The morning sun painted the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and crimson, but inside the mountain, time seemed suspended. Somewhere above them, an impossible aircraft carried an impossible pilot and a child whose fate now hung in the balance. The voice that had started as an intrusion was beginning to sound like something else entirely, a ghost returning home after decades in the cold. 23 years. That's how long it had been since anyone had heard that call sign. 23 years since the program that created Echo 77 had been officially terminated, its files sealed, its operatives scattered to the winds or buried in unmarked graves. But voices, like memories, have a way of surviving even the most thorough erasure. Major General Patricia Hawthorne was in her morning briefing when the call came through to her secure line. At 62, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had earned every star on her collar through decades of service in the shadows of military intelligence. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing, including the subtle tremor in her aide's voice when he interrupted her meeting. "Ma'am, we have a situation in the control room. They're requesting your immediate presence for a voice identification protocol." Hawthorne's expression didn't change, but those who knew her well would have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Voice identification protocols were reserved for the most sensitive operations, the kind that required clearance levels that technically didn't exist on any official organizational chart. She followed Lieutenant Colonel Barnes through the maze of corridors carved into the mountain's heart, past blast doors that could withstand nuclear attack, and through security checkpoints that scanned everything from retinal patterns to gait analysis. The control room hummed with barely contained tension when they arrived, dozens of technicians and officers monitoring screens that displayed an impossible scenario. "General, we've got an unknown aircraft requesting emergency landing. Single engine, appears to be a vintage fighter. The pilot is using an old call sign from classified operations." Captain Torres stepped forward, her tablet displaying the preliminary analysis results. Hawthorne took the tablet, her trained eye scanning the data. Aircraft type, impossible. Flight path, inexplicable. But it was the voice analysis that made her blood run cold. The computer was showing a 97% match to a voice pattern that should have been dead for over 2 decades. "Play the transmission," she ordered, her voice carrying the weight of command that had once directed covert operations across 3 continents. The speakers crackled to life, and suddenly Hawthorne was transported back to a briefing room in a classified location, listening to a young pilot receive orders for a mission that officially never happened. The voice was older now, marked by years and loss, but unmistakably the same. "Control, I know this looks bad. I know you're probably scrambling birds right now, but I need you to run my Voiceprint through the legacy systems. Tell the General that Echo 77 needs to come home." The tablet slipped from Hawthorne's fingers, clattering to the floor unnoticed. Around her, the control room fell silent as everyone watched their commanding officer's face cycle through emotions that had been buried for decades: shock, disbelief, guilt, and finally, something that might have been hope. "Stand down all intercept protocols," she whispered, then louder, with authority that brooked no argument. "Stand down all intercept protocols immediately. Give her landing clearance and prepare a medical team." Captain Torres stepped forward, confusion clear on her face. "General, we don't know if this is legitimate. The security implications." "I know exactly who this is," Hawthorne interrupted, her voice carrying pain that had been carefully compartmentalized for over 2 decades. "And I know exactly what she's been through to get here." The radio crackled again, and this time the voice carried a note of desperate hope. "Control, please. My daughter needs help. I wouldn't have come here if I had any other choice." Hawthorne moved to the communication console, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions coursing through her. She activated the secure channel, knowing that the words she was about to speak would resurrect a past that was supposed to stay buried. "Echo 77, this is Viper 1 Actual. You have clearance for immediate landing, runway 07. Medical team is standing by." She paused, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Welcome home, Lieutenant." The silence that followed stretched for an eternity before the reply came through, thick with emotion and exhaustion. "Thank you, General. Thank you for remembering." But Hawthorne hadn't forgotten. She had never forgotten Echo 77, or the mission that had gone so catastrophically wrong, or the young pilot who had been declared dead to protect national security. She had never forgotten the weight of the decision that had left one of her best operatives stranded in the cold, cut off from everything she had ever known. The morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado Rockies, but inside Cheyenne Mountain, the past and present were colliding in ways that would reshape everything they thought they knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of serving in the shadows. The aircraft that appeared on their radar screens 15 minutes later defied every assumption about what was possible. The P-51 Mustang had been modified extensively, modern avionics packages grafted onto the vintage airframe, additional fuel tanks that extended its range far beyond original specifications, and engine modifications that allowed it to operate at altitudes that should have been impossible for a piston-driven fighter. But it was the pilot's approach that truly impressed the tower controllers. Despite flying an aircraft that was nearly a century old, the pilot executed a textbook military approach, precise, controlled, and with the kind of situational awareness that spoke of thousands of hours in combat situations. "Phantom, you're cleared for landing. Medical team is standing by at the end of the runway," Martinez transmitted, his voice carrying more respect than protocol strictly required. The P-51 touched down with barely a whisper, its tires kissing the runway in a landing so smooth it seemed to defy physics. As it rolled to a stop, ground crews surrounded the aircraft, but it was the medical team that moved with the greatest urgency. General Hawthorne watched from the observation deck as the canopy opened and a figure emerged, tall, lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the weight of decades spent in the shadows. The pilot moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to trust no one and rely only on herself. But it was the small figure that the pilot lifted carefully from the rear seat that brought tears to Hawthorne's eyes. A little girl, unconscious and pale, wrapped in a flight jacket that was far too large for her small frame. The pilot's hands shook as she passed the child to the waiting medics, and for a moment, the mask of professional competence slipped to reveal the terrified mother beneath. "Ma'am, she's burning up with fever. She's been unconscious for 6 hours. I didn't know where else to go." The pilot's voice carried the same timbre that had identified her through the voice recognition system, but now it was raw with parental fear. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, but Hawthorne could see the pilot's reluctance to let her daughter go. Even after all these years, trust didn't come easily to someone who had been officially erased from existence. "She'll be safe," Hawthorne said quietly, approaching the pilot with the careful movements of someone who understood that any sudden motion might be interpreted as a threat. "Our medical facility is the best in the country. She'll have everything she needs." For the first time in 23 years, the woman known as Echo 77 looked directly at the general who had once been her commanding officer. The years had carved lines around her eyes and streaked her hair with silver, but there was something unbroken in her gaze that spoke of a strength that had endured every hardship. "General," she said simply, and in that single word was carried the weight of 2 decades of separation, betrayal, and survival against impossible odds. The medical team was already moving the child toward the medical facility, their movements efficient and purposeful. The pilot, whose real name was still classified even from most of the people watching, took a step to follow, then stopped as security personnel formed a subtle barrier around her. "Protocol, Lieutenant," Hawthorne said gently. "You know how this works, but I give you my word she'll be safe and you'll be with her as soon as we can process your return." The pilot's jaw tightened, and for a moment Hawthorne could see the ghost of the young officer who had once been the most promising pilot in the program. But the years had taught her patience, and she nodded once, accepting the necessity of the moment. "Her name is Kira," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's 7 years old and she's everything to me. If something happens to her because I brought her here—" "Nothing will happen to her," Hawthorne promised, and the conviction in her voice was absolute. "You have my word as an officer and as someone who owes you more than can ever be repaid." The pilot, Echo 77, nodded once and allowed herself to be escorted toward the debriefing facility. But as she walked away, Hawthorne could see the rigid control in her shoulders, the way she held herself ready for betrayal even in the moment of her greatest vulnerability. The general watched until the pilot disappeared into the mountain's depths, then turned to Captain Torres. "I want a full medical team on the child around the clock. Best doctors, best equipment, whatever she needs. And I want a complete security blackout on this incident until I can determine how to proceed." Ma'am, what about the pilot? She'll need to be processed, debriefed, potentially detained pending investigation of her status. Hawthorne's expression hardened. That pilot is a decorated officer who has been in deep cover for 23 years. She will be treated with the respect and dignity she has earned, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado peaks, the impossible had become reality. Echo 77 had come home, carrying with her not just the secrets of 2 decades in the shadows, but the most precious cargo of all, a child whose life now hung in the balance of military medicine and the unbreakable bonds of family. The debriefing room was sterile and windowless, designed to be both comfortable and secure. Echo 77 sat across from General Hawthorne, her hands steady despite the exhaustion etched in every line of her face. Between them on the metal table lay a folder marked with classification levels that didn't officially exist, containing a story that had been buried for over 2 decades. "Your daughter is stable," Hawthorne began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering news that could break or heal. "Pneumonia, but caught in time. The antibiotics are working and she's responding well to treatment." The relief that flooded across the pilot's face was immediate and overwhelming. For a moment, the mask of professional composure cracked completely, revealing the terrified mother who had flown halfway across the continent in a 70-year-old aircraft to save her child. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I wasn't sure if you'd help her." "Help her?" Hawthorne's voice carried a note of something that might have been hurt. "Lieutenant, you were one of mine. That little girl is family." The pilot's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the water glass on the table. "It's been a long time since I was anyone's lieutenant. A long time since I was anyone at all." Hawthorne opened the folder, her eyes scanning documents that told the story of a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong, and a pilot who had been erased from existence to protect national security. According to these files, Lieutenant Zara Blackwood died in a training accident 23 years ago. Her body was never recovered. "Lieutenant Blackwood did die," the pilot said quietly. "What came back from that mission was something else entirely." The mission had been classified at levels that existed only in the darkest corners of military intelligence. Operation Nightfall, a deep-cover insertion into hostile territory that required a pilot with unprecedented skill and unshakable loyalty. Lieutenant Zara Blackwood had been handpicked for the assignment, her service record reading like a testament to aviation excellence. But the mission had gone wrong in ways that no one could have anticipated. The extraction had failed, the support team had been compromised, and Lieutenant Blackwood had been left alone in enemy territory with intelligence that could have compromised national security for decades. "You were supposed to be extracted after 72 hours, Hawthorne said, her voice carrying the weight of guilt that had haunted her for over 2 decades. "When the extraction team was compromised, we made the decision to classify you as killed in action. It was supposed to be temporary until we could mount a rescue operation." "But the rescue never came," Zara said, her voice devoid of accusation but heavy with the weight of abandonment. "And I learned that sometimes the only person you can count on is yourself." The years that followed had been a masterclass in survival and adaptation. Cut off from all support, declared dead by her own government, Zara had been forced to build a new identity from nothing. She had used her skills as a pilot and her training as an intelligence officer to carve out a life in the shadows, always moving, always watching, always ready to run. "How did you survive?" Hawthorne asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "I became what I needed to be," Zara replied. "Smuggler, mercenary, ghost. I flew cargo runs across borders that officially don't exist. I transported people who needed to disappear. I learned to live without a country, without a home, without anyone who knew my real name." But the isolation had taken its toll. The woman who had once been the most promising pilot in the program had become something harder, more cynical, shaped by years of betrayal and survival. The idealistic young officer who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions had been burned away, leaving behind someone who trusted no one and expected betrayal from everyone. "What changed?" Hawthorne asked. "What brought you back?" For the first time since the debriefing began, Zara smiled, a small, sad expression that transformed her entire face. "I found something worth protecting, something worth risking everything for." The story of Kira's birth was one of the few bright spots in Zara's decades of exile. A brief relationship with a doctor in a small European town had given her something she had never expected: a daughter. The relationship hadn't lasted, but Kira had become the center of Zara's world, the one person who knew her not as Echo 77 or any of the other identities she had worn, but simply as Mom. "I tried to give her a normal life," Zara continued, her voice softening. "Enrolled her in school, found us a small apartment, tried to pretend we were just another single-parent family, but normal was never going to be possible for someone like me." The threats had started small: surveillance teams that appeared and disappeared, questions asked in the wrong places, pressure applied to people who had shown them kindness. Zara's past was catching up with her, and she knew that her daughter's safety depended on staying ahead of the people who wanted to use her for their own purposes. When she got sick, I was in Honduras, running medical supplies to villages that had been cut off by the hurricane. She was staying with a family I trusted, but when she didn't respond to treatment, I knew I had to take the risk. The P-51 Mustang had been Zara's most prized possession, an aircraft she had spent years modifying and perfecting. It was fast enough to outrun most pursuit aircraft, equipped with modern avionics that made it capable of flying in any weather. And most importantly, it was completely off the grid. No registration, no flight plans, no official existence. "I knew that coming here would expose everything I'd built," Zara continued. "I knew that it would mean facing the past I'd tried to leave behind. But when your child is dying, you don't think about the consequences. You just act." Hawthorne studied the woman across from her, seeing past the gray hair and the lines around her eyes to the young pilot who had once been the best in her command. "What do you need from us?" "I need my daughter to live," Zara said simply. "Everything else is secondary." The general closed the folder, her decision made. "Then that's what we'll focus on. Your daughter will have the best medical care available, and you'll be with her every step of the way." "And after she recovers?" Zara asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust promises. "After she recovers, we'll figure out how to give you both the life you deserve, the life you should have had all along." For the first time in 23 years, Zara Blackwood allowed herself to hope. The medical facility at Cheyenne Mountain was state-of-the-art, equipped to handle everything from routine care to complex surgical procedures. But it was the sight of her daughter, small and pale in the hospital bed, that nearly broke Zara's carefully maintained composure. Kira was awake, her dark eyes bright with fever but alert. When she saw her mother, she smiled, a weak but genuine expression that made Zara's heart contract with relief and love. "Mom," Kira whispered, her voice hoarse from the illness, "I knew you'd come." Zara pulled a chair close to the bed, taking her daughter's small hand in both of hers. "Of course I came. I told you I'd always find a way to take care of you." "The doctors say I'm getting better," Kira said, her voice gaining strength. "They say the medicine is working and I'll be able to go home soon." Home. The word carried a weight that Zara hadn't fully understood until this moment. For 7 years, home had been wherever the two of them were together. A series of temporary apartments, safe houses, and brief stops in their constant movement across the globe. But now, for the first time, the possibility of a real home, a place where they could stay, where Kira could grow up with friends and stability, seemed tantalizingly close. "Where is home, Mom?" Kira asked, her childish intuition picking up on the uncertainty in her mother's expression. Zara brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, her touch gentle and reassuring. Home is wherever we're together, baby, and right now that's here. Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatric specialist who had been treating Kira, entered the room with a chart in her hands and a smile on her face. The fever broke 2 hours ago, and her oxygen levels are back to normal. She's responding exceptionally well to treatment. The relief that flooded through Zara was physical, making her legs weak and her hands shake. When can she be discharged? Another 24 hours for observation, but she's definitely past the worst of it. You got her here just in time. Dr. Chen's expression was professional but warm. She's been asking about the airplane. She says her mom is the best pilot in the world. Zara felt her throat tighten with emotion. Despite everything they had been through, despite the constant uncertainty and danger, Kira had maintained a child's faith in her mother's abilities. It was a trust that Zara had never taken lightly and had spent 7 years trying to deserve. "Can I see it?" Kira asked, her eyes bright with curiosity despite her illness. "The airplane, I mean. I want to see how we got here." Zara looked at Dr. Chen, who nodded. A short trip to the hangar might actually be good for her. Fresh air, a change of scenery, as long as she's bundled up warm. An hour later, Zara was pushing a wheelchair through the mountain's corridors, Kira wrapped in blankets and chattering excitedly about the adventure they had just shared. The little girl's resilience was remarkable, already bouncing back from the illness that had nearly killed her, already eager to explore their new surroundings. The hangar was vast and echoing, filled with aircraft that represented decades of military aviation history. But it was the P-51 Mustang, sitting alone in the center of the space, that drew Kira's attention immediately. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It looks like something from a movie." Zara smiled, remembering her own first reaction to the aircraft. She had found it in a barn in rural France, forgotten and neglected, its original wartime markings barely visible under layers of dust and rust. Restoring it had been a labor of love, a project that had taken 3 years and every skill she had acquired in her years of exile. "It's not just beautiful," Zara said, her voice carrying pride. "It's special. This airplane and others like it helped win a war. They represented freedom and courage and the willingness to fight for what's right." General Hawthorne approached from across the hangar, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. She had been watching the reunion between mother and daughter with a mixture of professional interest and personal emotion. "Your mother is one of the finest pilots I've ever known," she said to Kira, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "She flew missions that no one else could handle, and she never failed to bring her aircraft home." Kira looked up at the general with the direct gaze of a child who had learned early to judge people by their actions rather than their words. "Are you going to help us?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. Hawthorne knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing herself to Kira's eye level. "Yes," she said simply, "we're going to help you, both of you." The promise hung in the air like a covenant, binding all 3 of them to a future that was still uncertain, but filled with possibilities that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zara Blackwood allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had finally found their way home. The safe house was comfortable but anonymous, a temporary residence that could have been anywhere in suburban America. It was the kind of place where people disappeared into normalcy, where the past could be carefully packed away, and a new future could be built from the ground up. Kira was asleep in the bedroom, her breathing steady and peaceful for the first time in days. The fever had broken completely, and Dr. Chen had pronounced her fully recovered. But it was the smile on her daughter's face as she slept that told Zara everything she needed to know about their decision to come here. "She's remarkable," General Hawthorne said, watching the sleeping child through the doorway. 7 years old, and she's already been through more than most people experience in a lifetime. "She's stronger than I ever was at her age," Zara replied, her voice carrying the fierce pride of a mother who had watched her child adapt to circumstances that would have broken most adults. "She's never known a stable home, never had friends she could keep, never stayed in one place long enough to feel truly safe. But she's never complained, never asked for anything except to be with me." They moved to the kitchen, where Hawthorne had prepared coffee and laid out a collection of documents that would reshape both their lives. The papers represented months of careful planning, the kind of bureaucratic miracle that could only happen when someone with sufficient authority decided to make the impossible possible. "New identities," Hawthorne explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what she was offering. "Complete backgrounds, employment history, school records for Kira, everything you need to build a legitimate life." Zara studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who had spent years learning to spot flaws in forged papers. But these weren't forgeries. They were official documents, created through channels that existed only in the deepest levels of government authorization. "Zara Mitchell," she read from the driver's license, testing the name on her tongue. "Aerospace engineer, relocated from Seattle to Colorado Springs for a new position with a government contractor." "The job is real," Hawthorne confirmed. "A private company that does classified work for the Air Force. Your cover story is that you're a civilian specialist brought in to consult on vintage aircraft restoration projects. It's close enough to your real skills that you won't have to fake the technical knowledge." "And Kira?" "Kira Mitchell, age 7, enrolling in 2nd grade at a school with excellent security protocols and a history of accommodating the children of people who work in sensitive positions." The name felt strange but liberating. For 7 years, Kira had been Kira Volkov, then Kira Santos, then Kira Chen, a series of identities that had protected her but never truly belonged to her. Now, for the first time, she would have a name that could last, a history that could be built upon rather than abandoned. "What about her father?" Zara asked, her voice carefully neutral. "The background check will show inconsistencies if anyone looks too closely." "Dr. Marcus Mitchell, deceased in a car accident when Kira was 3. Military records have been adjusted to show that you were married to a combat medic who died during a deployment." Hawthorne's expression was grim. "It's a common enough story that no one will question it, and it explains why you've been moving around so much, military widow trying to find stability for her daughter." The story was plausible, even touching. But Zara couldn't shake the feeling that accepting this new identity would mean truly killing the last remnants of Lieutenant Zara Blackwood, the young pilot who had once believed that service to country was the highest calling. "There's something else," Hawthorne continued, pulling out a final document. "A congressional citation for heroic service during classified operations. It's been sealed for 23 years, but it's going into your permanent record now." Zara stared at the document, feeling the weight of official recognition for sacrifices that had gone unacknowledged for over 2 decades. The citation was brief but specific: meritorious service in support of national security operations, extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy action, and sustained excellence in the performance of duties under extreme circumstances. "I don't need recognition," she said quietly. "I just need my daughter to have a chance at a normal life." "You need both," Hawthorne replied firmly. "Recognition matters, not just for your sake but for hers. Someday Kira will want to know about her mother's service. She'll want to understand why you made the sacrifices you did. This gives her something to be proud of." The general was right, and Zara knew it. Children needed heroes, and Kira deserved to know that her mother had been one of the best, even if the details of that service would always remain classified. "What about the P-51?" Zara asked. It's not exactly a legal aircraft anymore." Hawthorne smiled, the first genuine expression of humor Zara had seen from her former commanding officer. "The P-51 will be donated to the Air Force Museum, where it will undergo restoration by a team of experts. During that process, it will be thoroughly documented and eventually put on display as an example of World War II aviation excellence. And unofficially, it will be maintained in flight-ready condition and available for special occasions. The Air Force has a demonstration team that flies vintage aircraft at air shows. If the pilot of that particular aircraft wanted to occasionally take it up for proficiency flights, well, that would be entirely within regulations." The offer was more than Zara had dared to hope for. Not just a new identity and a chance at a normal life, but the possibility of continuing to fly, to maintain the skills that had defined her for so long. "Why," she asked simply, "why are you doing all this?" Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen window. "Because I failed you once, and I've lived with that failure for 23 years. Because you deserved better than what happened to you. And because that little girl in there deserves to grow up with a mother who isn't constantly looking over her shoulder." The admission hung between them, heavy with years of guilt and regret. But it was also a beginning, the first step toward healing wounds that had been festering for over 2 decades. "I won't pretend it will be easy," Hawthorne continued. "Learning to live a normal life after what you've been through. It's going to be an adjustment, but you're not alone anymore. You have support, you have resources, and you have people who understand what you've sacrificed." Zara nodded, feeling the weight of the future settling on her shoulders. It was a different kind of burden than the one she had carried for 7 years, but it was hers to bear. "When do we start?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Hawthorne replied. "Tomorrow, Zara Mitchell and her daughter Kira begin their new life in Colorado Springs. The past stays buried and the future begins with a clean slate." As the night deepened around the safe house, Zara allowed herself to imagine what that future might hold. A real home, with neighbors who knew their names and a school where Kira could make friends. A job that used her skills without requiring her to constantly watch for threats. A life where the worst danger might be a thunderstorm or a flat tire, rather than the constant threat of discovery and betrayal. It was a future worth fighting for, and for the first time in 23 years, Zara Blackwood, no, Zara Mitchell, believed it might actually be possible. The house on Maple Street was everything Zara had never allowed herself to dream about. 2 bedrooms, a small yard with a swing set, and neighbors who waved when they saw her getting the mail. It was aggressively normal, almost offensively suburban, and it was perfect. Kira had adapted to their new life with the resilience that had sustained her through 7 years of constant movement. Within a week, she had made friends with the girl next door, learned the names of 3 different dogs on their block, and announced that she wanted to join the school's soccer team. "Mom, can Emma come over after school?" Kira asked over breakfast, her voice carrying the casual confidence of a child who had finally found stability. "Her mom said it's okay if it's okay with you." Zara smiled, marveling at how quickly her daughter had embraced the concept of having friends who weren't temporary. "Of course she can come over. We can order pizza and watch a movie." It was such a normal conversation, such an ordinary moment, that Zara felt tears prick at her eyes. For 7 years, she had been so focused on keeping Kira safe that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be a mother planning a playdate. Her new job at Precision Aerospace had proven to be everything General Hawthorne had promised. The work was challenging but not dangerous, using her technical skills to restore and maintain vintage aircraft for both museum display and occasional demonstration flights. Her colleagues were professional and competent, and if they occasionally wondered about her extensive knowledge of aircraft modifications and survival techniques, they were polite enough not to ask. The P-51 Mustang had indeed been transferred to the Air Force Museum, where it underwent a complete restoration that brought it back to its original wartime configuration, at least on the surface. Beneath the historically accurate paint and markings, the aircraft retained all of its modern modifications, waiting for the day when it might be needed again. That day came sooner than expected. The call came on a Tuesday evening, just as Zara was helping Kira with her homework. The number was one she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Zara, it's Patricia. I need to ask you a favor." General Hawthorne's voice carried a tension that immediately put Zara on alert. In the 3 months since their reunion, their relationship had slowly evolved from commander and subordinate to something approaching friendship. But this call had nothing to do with their personal relationship. "What kind of favor?" Zara asked, already knowing that whatever Hawthorne was about to ask would complicate the peaceful life she had been building. "We have a situation, a diplomatic crisis that requires someone with your particular skill set, off the books, completely deniable and absolutely critical to national security." Zara looked at Kira, who was focused on her math homework with the intense concentration that 7-year-olds brought to multiplication tables. The normalcy of the moment, homework at the kitchen table, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of children playing outside, suddenly felt fragile and precious. "I'm not that person anymore," Zara said quietly. "I have responsibilities now, a daughter who needs me." "I know," Hawthorne replied, her voice carrying understanding but also urgency. "And I wouldn't ask if there was any other option. But there's an American diplomat being held in a country that doesn't officially exist, and the only way to get him out is through someone who can fly under the radar, literally." The details were classified, but Hawthorne painted a picture of a crisis that could escalate into international conflict if not handled with extreme discretion. A hostage situation in a region where official military action was impossible, where the only hope of rescue lay with someone who could operate completely outside normal channels. "The P-51?" Zara asked, already knowing the answer. "Modified for extreme range and equipped with the latest stealth technology. You'd be flying solo, completely unsupported, into some of the most hostile airspace in the world." It was exactly the kind of mission that had defined Zara's career before everything went wrong. The kind of impossible task that only someone with her skills and experience could even attempt. But that was before she had become a mother, before she had something more important than duty to consider. "I can't leave Kira," she said firmly. "Not even for a few days. She's been through too much already." "She wouldn't be alone," Hawthorne assured her. "I'd personally ensure her safety. She could stay with me or we could arrange for a trusted caregiver, whatever makes you comfortable." The offer was generous, but Zara knew her daughter well enough to understand that separation anxiety was still close to the surface. Kira had only recently begun to relax into their new life, to believe that this stability might actually last. "Give me 24 hours, Zara said finally. "I need to think about this." "You have 12 hours, Hawthorne replied, her voice carrying the weight of a crisis that wouldn't wait for personal considerations. "I'm sorry, Zara. I know what I'm asking." After ending the call, Zara sat in the kitchen for a long time, watching her daughter work on homework and struggling with a decision that would affect both their lives. The safe, normal existence they had built was everything she had dreamed of during 7 years of exile. But somewhere out there, an American was counting on rescue, and she might be the only person who could provide it. "Mom," Kira looked up from her math problems, her dark eyes curious. "Are you okay? You look sad." Zara forced a smile, reaching over to brush a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking about work." "Do you have to go away?" Kira asked, her intuition picking up on the tension in her mother's voice. The question hit Zara like a physical blow. Even at 7, Kira had learned to read the signs that meant their life was about to change again. The careful neutrality in her voice, the way she held herself ready for disappointment, it was heartbreaking evidence of how much instability had marked her young life. "I don't know yet," Zara said honestly. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together, just like we always have." Kira nodded solemnly, accepting the uncertainty with the resilience that had sustained her through 7 years of constant movement. "Will you tell me if you have to go?" "I'll tell you everything I can," Zara promised. "No more secrets, no more surprises. We're a team, remember." That night, after Kira had gone to bed, Zara stood in her backyard and looked up at the stars. The Colorado sky was clear and vast, unmarked by the light pollution that had hidden the stars in most of the places they had lived. It was the kind of sky that made a pilot's heart ache with longing, the kind of infinite space that called to anyone who had ever felt the freedom of flight. She thought about the diplomat, someone's father, husband, son, counting down the hours in a cell in a place that didn't appear on any map. She thought about the delicate balance of international relations that could be shattered by one wrong move, one failed negotiation, one life lost to political expedience. But mostly, she thought about Kira, sleeping peacefully in her own bed for the first time in her life, surrounded by the kind of security that most children took for granted. The decision, when it came, was both inevitable and heartbreaking. The next morning, Zara called General Hawthorne with her answer. "I'll do it," she said simply, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "If something goes wrong, if I don't make it back, you take care of Kira. Not just financially, but personally. She becomes part of your family, and she never has to wonder if she's wanted or loved." "Done," Hawthorne said without hesitation. "What else?" "This is the last time. After this mission, Echo 77 stays buried for good. I'm a mother now, and that's all I want to be." "Understood. Anything else?" Zara was quiet for a moment, thinking about the 7-year-old girl who had already sacrificed so much for her mother's past. "When I come back, we're going to have a real conversation about what my life was like before she was born. She deserves to know the truth, even if it's classified. I'll make sure she has the clearance necessary to understand her mother's service," Hawthorne promised. "Age-appropriate versions, of course, but the real story." The preparations took 6 hours. The P-51 was transported from the museum to a classified facility where it underwent final modifications, extended-range fuel tanks, advanced communication equipment, and navigation systems that would allow it to operate in complete radio silence. The aircraft that had once been a symbol of American air power in World War II was being transformed into a ghost, capable of penetrating the most sophisticated air defense systems without leaving a trace. Zara spent the time with Kira, trying to explain why Mommy had to go away for work without revealing the true nature of the mission. They went to the park, had lunch at Kira's favorite restaurant, and spent the afternoon reading together on the couch. "How long will you be gone?" Kira asked as they prepared dinner together. "A few days," Zara said, adding the way the half-truth felt on her tongue. "General Hawthorne will stay with you, and you can call me whenever you want." "Will you be safe?" The question hung between them, heavy with all the unspoken fears that had shaped their relationship. Zara knelt beside her daughter, taking her small hands in both of hers. "I will be as safe as I can be," she said carefully, "and I will do everything in my power to come back to you. But if something happens, I need you to know that you are the most important thing in my life. You are my heart, my purpose, my reason for everything I do." Kira nodded solemnly, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, baby, more than all the stars in the sky." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Zara tucked her daughter into bed and kissed her good night, knowing that it might be the last time. The weight of that possibility should have been crushing, but instead it filled her with a fierce determination to succeed, to return, to be the mother that Kira deserved. The P-51 Mustang sat on the darkened runway like a ghost from another era, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the starlight. The aircraft had been transformed from a museum piece into a cutting-edge instrument of covert operations, but it still retained the elegant lines and purposeful beauty that had made it legendary. General Hawthorne stood beside the aircraft, her expression grim but resolute. The target is a compound approximately 800 miles southeast of here. Intelligence suggests the diplomat is being held in a structure that's too well defended for a conventional rescue operation. What's the extraction plan? Zara asked, already running through the tactical considerations in her mind. You don't extract him. You provide a distraction, a flyover that draws attention away from the main compound while a ground team moves in. The timing has to be perfect, and the aircraft has to be visible enough to draw fire but maneuverable enough to avoid being hit. It was a suicide mission disguised as a support operation, the kind of task that required someone with nothing left to lose, someone who could accept the possibility of never coming home. But Zara had everything to lose now, and that changed the equation completely. "I'm coming back," she said firmly, as much to herself as to Hawthorne. "That little girl needs her mother, and I'm not going to let her down." "I know," Hawthorne replied. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this job. You have something worth surviving for." The P-51's engine fired with a roar that echoed across the empty airfield, a sound that spoke of power and purpose, and the eternal human desire to slip the bonds of Earth. As Zara taxied toward the runway, she thought about Kira sleeping in her bed, dreaming of soccer games and sleepovers and all the normal things that made childhood precious. The aircraft lifted off into the star-filled sky, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a mother who had finally found something worth fighting for. Behind her, the lights of Colorado Springs faded into the distance, but ahead lay the darkness of a mission that would test every skill she had learned in 23 years of service. Echo 77 was airborne again, flying toward a destiny that would either bring her home to her daughter or ensure that Kira would grow up knowing that her mother had died as she had lived, in service to something greater than herself. The flight southeast took her over terrain that shifted from the familiar peaks of Colorado to the vast emptiness of the American Southwest. The P-51 performed flawlessly, its modified engine maintaining cruise speed, while the advanced navigation systems guided her toward a destination that existed only in classified files. Radio silence was absolute. For the next 8 hours, Zara would be completely alone, cut off from all support and relying entirely on her own skills and judgment. It was a familiar sensation, one that had defined much of her adult life, but now it felt different. Now she had something to return to, someone who would be waiting for her regardless of the outcome. The border crossing was uneventful, the aircraft's stealth modifications rendering it invisible to the radar systems that monitored the airspace. She was flying through the sovereign territory of a nation that didn't officially exist, over landscapes that appeared on no public maps, toward a target that would be disavowed by all parties if the mission went wrong. As the hours passed, Zara found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. The young pilot who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, driven by a sense of duty and a belief that service to country was the highest calling. The woman who had been abandoned by that same country, left to survive in the shadows with nothing but her skills and her determination. The mother who had found purpose in protecting something precious and innocent. All of those versions of herself were present in the cockpit of the P-51, but it was the mother who ultimately controlled the stick. Every decision, every maneuver, every calculation was filtered through the knowledge that Kira was waiting for her to come home. The target compound appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to rise, a collection of buildings surrounded by defensive positions that spoke of serious military preparation. Intelligence had been accurate. This was not a place that could be approached by conventional means. Phoenix Base, this is Echo 77. Target acquired. Beginning approach for distraction run. The radio crackled with static, then cleared to reveal the voice of the ground team commander. Echo 77, Phoenix Base. We're in position. Execute on your mark. Zara banked the P-51 into a steep dive, the aircraft's engine screaming as it accelerated toward the compound. The distraction had to be dramatic enough to draw attention away from the rescue operation, but controlled enough to avoid unnecessary casualties. The first burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted from the compound's defensive positions, bright tracers streaking past the aircraft's wings. Zara rolled inverted and pulled hard, the P-51 responding with the precision that had made it legendary. The aircraft danced through the defensive fire, close enough to be threatening, but agile enough to avoid being hit. Phoenix Base, Echo 77, distraction initiated. You have your window. Copy, Echo 77, moving to extraction point. The ground team had 60 seconds to reach the building where the diplomat was being held. 60 seconds that Zara had to buy with her life and her aircraft, drawing fire away from the rescue operation while staying alive long enough to complete the mission. The defensive fire intensified, filling the air with deadly metal that sought to bring down the ghost that had appeared in their midst. Zara pushed the P-51 to its limits, using every skill she had learned in 2 decades of flying to stay ahead of the guns that tracked her across the dawn sky. Phoenix Base, Echo 77, status report. Package secured, moving to extraction point. The diplomat was free, but the mission wasn't over. The ground team needed covering fire for their withdrawal, and Zara was the only asset available to provide it. She brought the P-51 around in a wide circle, staying low and fast to avoid the surface-to-air missiles that were beginning to track her movement. Echo 77, Phoenix Base. We're taking heavy fire, need immediate support. Zara could see the extraction point, a cleared area where a helicopter was waiting to pick up the rescue team and their precious cargo. But the defensive fire was intensifying, and the ground team was pinned down by automatic weapons fire from the compound. The decision came instinctively, born of years of training and the unshakable conviction that no American would be left behind. Zara rolled the P-51 into a strafing run, the aircraft's guns blazing as she swept across the compound's defensive positions. The return fire was immediate and devastating. Armor-piercing rounds tore through the aircraft's fuselage, shattering instruments and sending fragments of metal spinning through the cockpit. The P-51 shuddered under the impact, its engine coughing as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen. Phoenix Base, Echo 77, package is clear. Repeat, package is clear. The helicopter was lifting off, carrying the rescued diplomat to safety. The mission was complete, but the cost was becoming clear. The P-51 was dying around her, its engine failing and its control surfaces responding sluggishly to her commands. Echo 77, Phoenix Base, what's your status? Zara looked at the instrument panel, seeing the red warning lights that told the story of an aircraft that had given everything it had. The engine was overheating, the fuel tanks were leaking, and the hydraulic system was failing. She had maybe 10 minutes of flight time left, and she was still deep in hostile territory. Phoenix Base, Echo 77, aircraft is damaged, attempting to reach friendly territory. But even as she spoke the words, Zara knew that the P-51 wouldn't make it home. The aircraft that had carried her through so many impossible missions was finally reaching the end of its service, and she was going to have to find another way to get back to her daughter. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 23 years of surviving impossible odds, she was going to die in an aircraft that had been built to fight a war that ended before she was born, on a mission that would never be officially acknowledged, trying to save a man whose name she didn't even know. But as the engine finally seized, and the P-51 began its final descent toward the unforgiving landscape below, Zara thought about Kira sleeping peacefully in her bed, dreaming of soccer games and sleepovers and all the normal things that made childhood precious. The knowledge that she had given her daughter 3 months of stability, 3 months of what it felt like to be a normal child, was worth any price. The aircraft hit the ground hard, cartwheeling across the desert floor before coming to rest in a twisted heap of metal and memories. But in the final seconds before impact, Zara managed to transmit one last message, a message that would find its way through classified channels to a general who had waited 23 years for redemption, and to a 7-year-old girl who would spend the rest of her life trying to understand what it meant to be the daughter of a hero. Tell Kira that her mother loved her more than all the stars in the sky. Tell her that everything I did was for her. Tell her to be brave, to be strong, and to never forget that she was worth everything. The transmission ended in static, but the message would live on, carried by the wind across the desert, and by the memories of those who had known that sometimes the price of freedom was paid by those who would never see its benefits. Echo 77 was gone, but the legacy of her service would endure in the life of a little girl, who would grow up knowing that her mother had been the best of what America could produce, a warrior who had sacrificed everything for the belief that some things were worth dying for. The notification came through official channels at 600 hours local time. General Hawthorne was in her office, having been unable to sleep while waiting for word from the mission, when the encrypted message appeared on her secure terminal. The text was brief and clinical, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. Echo 77 KIA, mission successful, package recovered, aircraft destroyed, pilot status confirmed. Hawthorne stared at the message for a long time, feeling the weight of another failure settle on her shoulders. 46 years of military service, and she had never learned to accept the loss of good people for necessary causes. The rational part of her mind understood that the mission had been a success. The diplomat was safe, international tensions had been diffused, and the crisis had been resolved without escalation. But the personal cost was devastating. In the space of a few hours, she had lost one of the finest pilots she had ever known, and gained the responsibility of raising a 7-year-old girl who would wake up in a few hours expecting her mother to return home. The safe house felt different when Hawthorne arrived. The atmosphere of temporary sanctuary had been replaced by something heavier, more permanent. Kira was still asleep, her small form curled under blankets that smelled like the lavender fabric softener her mother had used. In a few hours, she would wake up as an orphan, though she didn't know it yet. Hawthorne sat in the kitchen where she had watched Zara struggle with the decision to accept the mission. The coffee maker was still programmed to brew at 6:30, the way Zara had said it every morning since they moved into the house. The normalcy of the routine felt like a mockery now, a reminder of the life that had been shattered by duty and sacrifice. The question of how to tell a 7-year-old that her mother was never coming home was one that no amount of military training could prepare someone for. Hawthorne had broken bad news to families before, had stood in dress uniform on doorsteps, and delivered the formal notification that someone's loved one had died in service to their country. But this was different. This was personal. Kira woke up at 7:30, exactly as she had every morning since they had established their routine. She padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, her dark hair tousled from sleep, expecting to find her mother making breakfast and getting ready for another day of normal life. Instead, she found General Hawthorne sitting at the kitchen table, still in her military uniform, looking older than her 62 years. "Where's Mom?" Kira asked, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of a child who had learned not to panic at unexpected changes. Hawthorne had rehearsed this moment in her mind, had planned the words she would use and the way she would break the news gently. But faced with the reality of Kira's trusting expression, all of her preparation crumbled. "She's not coming back, sweetheart," Hawthorne said quietly. She was hurt very badly while she was helping someone, and the doctors couldn't save her. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kira stood perfectly still for a moment, processing the information with the careful attention she had learned to give to adult conversations that would affect her life. "Is she dead?" Kira asked, her voice steady but small. "Yes," Hawthorne confirmed, adding the word and everything it represented. "She died helping to save someone else's life. She was very brave, and she was thinking about you right until the end." The tears came then, not the dramatic sobs of a child who had been sheltered from loss, but the quiet, heartbroken weeping of someone who had already experienced too much abandonment in her young life. Hawthorne gathered her into her arms, holding her close while she cried for the mother who had given everything to give her daughter a chance at a normal life. "What happens to me now?" Kira asked through her tears, the question that had been at the center of her existence for 7 years. "You stay with me," Hawthorne said firmly. "Your mother made me promise to take care of you, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. You're part of my family now, and you always will be." The funeral was small and private, attended by a handful of people who had known Zara Blackwood in various incarnations throughout her life. There was no military honor guard, no flag-draped casket, no official recognition of her service. The woman who had been Echo 77 was buried as Zara Mitchell, aerospace engineer and devoted mother, her true identity known only to those who had clearance to understand what she had sacrificed. But the P-51 Mustang had one final flight to make. The aircraft that had carried her through her last mission was recovered from the crash site and painstakingly restored, not to its wartime configuration, but to the exact specifications that Zara had maintained during her years of exile. It was a labor of love performed by technicians who understood that they were not just rebuilding a machine, but preserving a legacy. The restored aircraft was unveiled at the Air Force Museum 6 months later, displayed in a place of honor with a placard that told only part of the story. The public would know it as an example of World War II aviation excellence, maintained and flown by a civilian contractor who had died in a training accident. But those who knew the truth would understand that it was a monument to something much more profound, the story of a pilot who had given everything for the belief that some things were worth any sacrifice. Kira stood before the aircraft on the day it was unveiled, her hand clasped in General Hawthorne's, looking up at the machine that had carried her mother through so many impossible journeys. At 7 years old, she was still too young to understand the full scope of what her mother had done, but she was old enough to recognize that the airplane represented something important, something worth remembering. "She was the best pilot who ever lived," Hawthorne told her, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "And she loved you more than anything else in the world." As they stood there together, looking up at the aircraft that had become a symbol of sacrifice and devotion, Kira made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Someday, she would learn to fly. Someday, she would understand what it meant to slip the bonds of earth and touch the face of the sky. Someday, she would be worthy of the legacy her mother had left her. But for now, she was content to be 7 years old, to hold the hand of the woman who had become her guardian, and to know that somewhere in the vast blue sky above them, her mother was still watching over her, still protecting her, still loving her more than all the stars in the sky. The years that followed were a gradual process of healing and growth. Kira thrived under General Hawthorne's care, blossoming into a confident and capable young woman who excelled in school and showed a natural aptitude for leadership. The loss of her mother remained a defining part of her identity, but it was balanced by the knowledge that she had been deeply loved and that her mother's sacrifice had meaning. As she grew older, Kira was gradually given access to more details about her mother's service, age-appropriate briefings that painted a picture of a woman who had served her country with distinction, who had faced impossible odds with courage and skill, and who had ultimately given her life to save others. The classified nature of the operations meant that many details would always remain secret, but the essence of her mother's character came through clearly. By the time she turned 16, Kira had decided that she wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps. Not as a covert operative, that world had changed too much for the kind of deep-cover operations that had defined Zara's career, but as a military pilot. She wanted to understand what had driven her mother to risk everything for the chance to fly, to serve, to make a difference. General Hawthorne, now retired but still closely involved in Kira's life, supported her decision while making sure she understood the full weight of what military service meant. The conversations they had were honest and sometimes difficult, acknowledging both the honor and the burden of wearing the uniform. "Your mother never wanted you to feel obligated to follow her path," Hawthorne explained during one of their talks. "She wanted you to have choices, to be able to live the normal life that she never had." "But this is what I want," Kira insisted, her voice carrying the same determination that had marked her mother's speech. "I want to serve something bigger than myself. I want to make a difference." The application process for the Air Force Academy was rigorous, but Kira's academic record, leadership experience, and family history of service made her a strong candidate. The interview process was more complicated, requiring careful navigation of the classified aspects of her background, but her mother's service record, what could be officially acknowledged, worked in her favor. The day she received her acceptance letter was bittersweet. Kira felt the pride and excitement of achieving a goal she had worked toward for years, but she also felt the absence of the person who should have been there to celebrate with her. General Hawthorne was there, of course, beaming with pride and talking about the future with the kind of enthusiasm that had sustained their relationship through the difficult years. But it was later, when she was alone in her room, that Kira felt the full weight of the moment. She looked at the acceptance letter, then at the photograph of her mother that had occupied a place of honor on her desk for 9 years. The image showed Zara in civilian clothes, smiling and holding an infant Kira, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of depths and experiences that would always remain partly mysterious. "I'm going to make you proud, Mom," Kira whispered to the photograph. "I'm going to be the kind of pilot and the kind of person you would want me to be." The Air Force Academy was everything Kira had expected and more. The academic challenges were intense, the physical demands were brutal, and the military training was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it in the image of an officer. But Kira thrived in the environment, drawing on the resilience that had been forged in her early years of constant movement and uncertainty. Her flight training began in her second year, and it was then that she truly understood what had driven her mother to risk everything for the chance to fly. The moment when the training aircraft lifted off for her first solo flight, when she felt the earth fall away beneath her and the sky open up in all directions, was a revelation that connected her to something primal and profound. The aircraft responded to her touch with the same precision that had made her mother legendary, and Kira began to understand that she had inherited more than just her mother's determination. She had inherited her mother's gift for flight, the rare combination of technical skill and intuitive understanding that separated good pilots from great ones. Her instructors noticed immediately. There was something about the way she handled the aircraft, the way she seemed to anticipate its responses and work with it rather than against it, that marked her as exceptional. By the end of her first year of flight training, she was being talked about as one of the most promising pilot candidates in her class. But it was during her advanced training that Kira began to understand the full scope of what her mother had achieved. The classified briefings that came with her security clearance revealed details of missions that had been hidden from the public, operations that had required skills and courage that bordered on the impossible. The more she learned, the more she realized that her mother had been more than just a good pilot. She had been a legend, someone whose name was spoken with reverence in the classified corridors of military aviation. The fact that her service had been largely erased from official records made it all the more remarkable. As her training progressed, Kira began to attract attention from instructors who had known her mother. They were careful about what they said, bound by classification levels that prevented them from discussing specifics, but their respect for Zara's service was evident in the way they approached her daughter's training. "Your mother was one of the best pilots I ever flew with," Colonel Martinez told her during a training debriefing. "She had a gift for understanding aircraft and a courage that was absolutely fearless. You have the same instincts, the same natural ability." The comparison was both flattering and intimidating. Kira wanted to honor her mother's memory, but she also wanted to establish her own identity as a pilot and as an officer. The balance between living up to her mother's legacy and creating her own path was a challenge that would define her military career. Graduation from the academy was a moment of triumph that was tempered by the knowledge that her mother should have been there to share it. General Hawthorne was in the audience, of course, along with a small group of people who had known Zara and understood what this moment represented. But the empty seat that should have been occupied by her mother was a reminder of the price that had been paid for the freedom to serve. As she walked across the stage to receive her commission, Kira thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened child in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang to a newly commissioned officer in the United States Air Force, she had traveled a path that had been shaped by loss and sacrifice, but also by love and determination. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities and challenges that she was eager to embrace. She would fly fighters, serve her country, and perhaps even take on the kind of dangerous missions that had defined her mother's career. But whatever path she chose, she would carry with her the knowledge that she was the daughter of a hero, someone who had given everything for the belief that some things were worth any sacrifice. The assignment to the 422nd Fighter Squadron came 2 years after graduation, following advanced training that had confirmed what her instructors had suspected. Kira Mitchell was one of the most naturally gifted pilots of her generation. The squadron flew F-22 Raptors, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, and was tasked with missions that required the highest levels of skill and security clearance. Her call sign, when it came, was both an honor and a burden. Phoenix had been chosen by her squadron mates in recognition of her background, the daughter of a legendary pilot who had risen from the ashes of her mother's sacrifice to become a skilled aviator in her own right. But call signs in fighter squadrons were more than just radio identifiers. They were part of a pilot's identity, a name that would follow them throughout their career. The first time she heard Phoenix over the radio during a training mission, Kira felt the weight of expectation and legacy settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just another pilot. She was the daughter of Echo 77, carrying forward a tradition of excellence that had been forged in the shadows of classified operations. Her squadron commander, Colonel Sarah Chen, was one of the few people who knew the full story of Zara's service. She had been a young captain when Echo 77 had been declared dead, and she had followed the classified reports of the covert operations that had made Zara legendary. "Your mother was a ghost," Chen told her during a private conversation. "She could fly missions that no one else could handle, go places that officially didn't exist, and complete objectives that were impossible for conventional forces. But she was also human, and she made the choice to leave that life behind when she found something more important." The conversation was a reminder that heroism wasn't just about individual courage or skill. It was about the choices people made and the values they chose to serve. Zara had been a skilled pilot and a dedicated officer, but her greatest achievement had been becoming a mother who would risk everything to protect her child. As Phoenix settled into her role with the squadron, she began to understand that her mother's legacy was not just about the missions she had flown or the lives she had saved. It was about the example she had set of someone who could balance duty and love, service and sacrifice, the needs of the country and the needs of the family. The missions came regularly, training exercises that pushed the limits of both pilot and aircraft, deployments that took her to regions where American interests were at stake, and occasionally, operations that required the kind of skills and discretion that had made her mother legendary. Each mission was a test of her abilities and her judgment, but also a chance to prove that she was worthy of the legacy she had inherited. The first time she flew combat operations, Phoenix understood what her mother had experienced during those classified missions decades earlier. The intensity of aerial combat, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, the knowledge that failure could have consequences far beyond personal loss, all of it combined to create a level of stress and excitement that few people ever experienced. But it was during a rescue mission over hostile territory that Phoenix truly understood what it meant to be her mother's daughter. The operation was classified, involving the extraction of a downed pilot from a region where official military action was impossible. The parallels to her mother's final mission were unmistakable, and Phoenix felt the weight of history as she flew her F-22 through enemy airspace. The mission was successful. The pilot was rescued, and Phoenix returned to base with her aircraft intact and her reputation enhanced. But the experience left her with a deeper understanding of the choices her mother had made and the prices she had paid for them. That night, as she sat in her quarters writing the mission report, Phoenix thought about the photograph of her mother that still occupied a place of honor on her desk. The image showed Zara in civilian clothes, smiling and holding infant Kira, but now Phoenix could see something else in her mother's eyes, the knowledge that love,